a very, very brief presentation. Every year we give something we call the annual Jim Terrain Award. And it'll become obvious as I tell you about this year's awardee. This year's awardee is Caitlin Hawk, who lives in our neighborhood. Having majored in French and anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, Caitlin Hawk served for many years as executive director of the Pasteur Institute, also in our neighborhood. It was through the Pasteur connection that historian Bert Hansen, that we have the history, or through the history group, met Caitlin. And we were planning a series about medical institutions in the neighborhood in 2015. Caitlin helped us out with the event featuring Bert Hansen's research on the New York Pasteur Institute, which was once located at 97th Street in Central Park West, the site of the groundbreaking scientific research on rabies and tetanus vaccines. Fascinating story. Caitlin moved to our neighborhood in 1990, and our interest in our history goes far beyond the New York Pasteur Institute. She's developed an extensive collection of historical photographs of our immediate neighborhood and researched the context of each, turning up many fascinating stories that she's hosted in her Throwback Thursdays post in a blog she writes for the West 102nd, 103rd Street Block Association. Not only have we been impressed with her own research, we've also appreciated other ways in which she's promoted our neighborhood history. Over the years, as a volunteer with the Block Association, as well as an early volunteer with Bloomingdale Aging in Place, she's encouraged others to dig out their historical photographs and create oral history, as well as spreading the word about the group's events. In 2020, Caitlin presented the history of her own building, 855 West End Avenue, in our series. She lovingly told of the Civil War era actress Maggie Mitchell, who built the apartments, lived there with her family, and named the building the St. Amdroche, an allusion to the theatrical role that made her famous. Caitlin gave her own home such a personal story that it almost came alive that evening. Though we on the History Group Planning Committee admire and enjoy every other's work, our Terrain Award is for those who research and promote the history of our neighborhood independently. Caitlin, through her tireless industry and interest in the people and places around her, exemplifies this. May I add, her love of the neighborhood leads her also to contribute her energies to creating the history of our neighborhood that she would like to see, both as past coordinator of the activities for the Bloomingdale Aging in Place and through her current activities and professional work as Associate Director and programming at the Columbia Aging Center, a university-wide center housed at the Mailman School of Public Health. So thank you, Caitlin, and 3 cheers to you.
Hi, Jim. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how moved I am to receive this honor, but I wanted to back up to a conversation we were having right before we went live, because I noticed that Louis had the question about the name of our neighborhood, and I've observed over the last many years that every 10 years or so, the New York Times does a real estate fluff piece about our neighborhood, and each time it gives it a different name. So in 1986, for example, it called the neighborhood the Upper West Side, attracting new settlers. And then in 97, it called it a family enclave that some people call SoCo, south of Columbia. And then in 2017, they called it Manhattan Valley, a diverse neighborhood bordering Central Park. And just a couple weeks ago, it was a feature that was entitled A More Affordable Pocket of the Upper West Side. And in that article, it said, quote, residents treasure this attainable neighborhood where everyone has an interesting story to tell. And I thought that sounded like a great mantra for the history group. But these New York Times pieces always miss the point, and this goes to some of your remarks, Jim, that Bloomingdale is not a suburb of the Upper West Side, but it's a great neighborhood unto itself. And I know that for most of the people watching tonight, this is not a news flash. They know it already, they have it in their bones. I've seen the bodies strewn all over the hostel floor when the history group makes its presentations month in and month out. And I know that the audience's appetite for history and for these interesting stories that the Times talks about is insatiable. But the beauty of the history group is the community that you create. It's not just that you raise up the stories and unearth them. It's the sense of community we feel when we come together with the group. So I have to thank my friend historian Bert Hansen, who introduced me to Wynne Armstrong 20 years ago, and of whom I'm very, very fond. And while I'm not a historian, I think of history as the pursuit of stories of people who came before us. And in my blog, I might start with an archival photograph of a facade or an old newspaper clipping, and there might be the mention of a name or a person, but what it's always missing is bringing the flesh to the bones of the story. And I know Pam Tice knows this well from all of the work she does, and Jim, you know it from all of your research of figures. What Jim Terrain did was preserve the flesh. The people who pass on the stories that the historians yearn for. And his neighbors' glue. The story of Jim Terrain is that he brought the neighbors of his community back together after the buildings in his community were demolished. And you see his street behind me. And so in honor of Jim, I chose this background. Jim's actually here in 1954 before the demolition. So to receive this award is really, with Jim Terrain's name on it, really means the world to me, and to have it come from the history group is very meaningful, because Jim acted upon history. He changed its course by keeping old neighbors in touch and the spirit of that street alive. And I don't really do anything akin to that, although you're very generous in what you say. But I've felt great satisfaction in exchanging with readers like Wilbur Jimenez and Jimmy Roberts and Michael Abalafia and Anthony Belov, Gil, Pam Tice, you, Jim, the Broadway merchants. Lots of people have shared stories and knowledge with me, and mostly what they share is their love of Bloomingdale. So I just wanted to thank Hetty Campbell, who invited me to write for the Block Association 400 blog posts ago. I don't think either of us thought it would go on that long. My thanks to Wynne and Vita and Marjorie and Peter and Nancy and Jim and Gil and Pam and all the members of the organization's committee. You are very able custodians of our collective stories, and you've enriched my life a lot with your programs, and I love them. And just to give the last word to Jim Terrain, while he was reminiscing years after the demolition of this street, he said, "I never left the old neighborhood. That is my village. Bloomingdale is my village too, and I wish Jim were still here to savor our past, to help us not repeat some of it, and to make more history together." So I happily share this award in his name and his beautiful memory, and I share it with the readers of the blog, and I invite anyone else to come and view the blog and enjoy the history of our neighborhood. Thank you so much.
Great. And thank you, Caitlin, so much. And with no further ado, let me introduce another fellow Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group member, Pam Tice, who will introduce our featured speaker for the evening. Pam?
Thanks, Jim. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Louis Picone. Louis is an award-winning author. Tonight's talk is based on his most recent book, Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant and the Making of an American Pantheon. You can find a link to purchase Louis's books, which are excellent choices for holiday gifts, at his website, louispicone.com. Michael has posted this link on the chat this evening, and you can also find it at the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group's website. Louis's other books are The President is Dead, The Extraordinary Stories of Presidential Deaths, Final Days, Burials, and Beyond, and also Where the Presidents Were Born, The History and Preservation of the Presidential Birthplaces. Louis is a member of the Authors Guild, Mensa International, and the American Historical Association. He's also a trustee on the board of the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial Association in Caldwell, New Jersey. He holds a master's in history and also teaches at William Patterson University. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Louis Picone. Thanks, Louis.
Well, thank you, Pam. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, as well as thank you, Jim, and Thank you, Janet and Michael, for the technical help. And congratulations to Caitlin for winning her award. Obviously well-deserved, and thank you. So, can everyone see my screen, or can folks see my screen?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
So, Grant's tomb. Now, one thing I found very interesting in writing my book, that when most people think of Grant's tomb, the first person that they think of isn't necessarily Ulysses S. Grant. But many people, the first person they think of is Groucho Marx. And Groucho Marx, of course, had said that famous joke in the 1950s, "Who's buried in Grant's tomb?" on his TV program, You Bet Your Life. But one thing that I found is, inevitably, when I mentioned that I was writing a book about Grant's tomb, the first thing that people would tell me is, well, who's buried in Grant's tomb? And some people knew that it was a joke, but way more than I could believe didn't realize that it was a joke. They thought that Grant wasn't buried in Grant's tomb, and they were curious who was. So it struck me as curious that Grant's tomb is this architectural wonder. It's the largest tomb in American history, before or since, and it's widely slipped from public memory. So I tried in my book to bring it back from public memory, or to bring it back, or to raise it to the forefront of people's memory. And the story of Grant's tomb isn't just a story of a building or of a tomb. It's a story of people. And as Caitlin so eloquently put, that in my book, I tried to put some flesh to the bones of the story, and tell the story of those people that were so influential and so critical to Grant's tomb. The first of which, obviously, is Ulysses S. Grant. Now, in the early 1880s, after Grant had left the presidency, America was in the middle, or at the onset, of the Gilded Age. It was a period of huge economic boom, America really turning into a world powerhouse. But the country was still greatly divided. This was only one generation after the Civil War. But Grant, who was living in New York City at the time, he was living on 3 East 66th Street, was the most popular man in America. Now, a generation after the Civil War, Grant was beloved by Democrats and Republicans, by people north and south of the border, by whites and African Americans, by men and women. Perhaps the only figure that was so universally loved in the country. In the North, he had liberated 4 million enslaved, saved the Union, and destroyed the KKK when it started to form during Reconstruction. In the South, he was the magnanimous victor who treated Southerners generously during the Civil War. And it wasn't just Lee giving generous terms at Appomattox, but he also treated Southern soldiers, captured soldiers, Southern citizens, with compassion and dignity throughout the war. But to be clear, Grant was never an apologist for the South. And the lost cause revisionism that came later on, that spoke of the Civil War, the cause of the Civil War as being over states' rights or the Southern way of life, Grant considered that nonsense. And he placed the reason for the Civil War solely on slavery, and he said so in his memoirs. He said that the cause of the Great War of the Rebellion against the United States will have to be attributed to slavery. Now, Grant was also arguably the most popular man in the world at this time. After he was president for 2.5 years, Grant traveled the world. He went all through Europe. He went to Africa. He went to Asia. He went to Russia. He went to the Holy Land. And everywhere he went, he was greeted like a hero. He was greeted like royalty. Kings would line up to meet him. In 1884, so 7 years after leaving the presidency, Grant, again, living in New York City, was on top of the world. He was healthy and he was wealthy. He had made millions of dollars from investing in a brokerage firm in New York City. But by the end of the year, Grant was not only bankrupt, but he was diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. In May, he had found out that the securities firm that he'd invested in was what they would later call a Ponzi scheme. And when he thought he was a millionaire, he found out within an instant that he was bankrupt, and not only bankrupt, he was deep in debt. Several months later, when he experienced a pain in his throat and went to the doctor, he was diagnosed with inoperable throat and tongue cancer. So I mentioned that the story of Grant's tomb is a story of people. Two people that I'd like to talk about right now is Julia Grant, Grant's beloved wife of 36 years. Now, upon receiving this traumatic news that he was bankrupt and diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer, and he knew his time was now limited, his number one concern was making sure that his wife and his children were financially secure, and they didn't have to pay for his mistakes and have to live with his bankruptcy and be financially destitute. Now, the other man that plays a critical role in this story is perhaps the second most popular man in America in 1884, and that was Mark Twain. Because after Grant was diagnosed with cancer, he went straight from the doctor's office to Century Publishing Company. Now, why did he do that? Well, for years, publishing houses have been after Grant to write his Civil War memoirs. Civil War memoirs, a generation after the Civil War, had become somewhat of a cottage industry, where everyone from privates to generals were writing their memoirs. But Grant was always the white whale. He's the one that publishing houses really wanted to get his memoirs. But Grant always demurred. For one reason, he didn't think he was a very good writer, and he was very humble, and he didn't believe that people really wanted to read his memoirs. But also significantly, Grant didn't need the money. He was what he believed financially secure. But now that he was bankrupt, he realized that one option that he had was to write his memoirs, so Julia and her children could enjoy the royalties. Luckily, Grant didn't sign on the dotted line on that day with Century Publishing. He took the contract that they offered him home, and within several days, one of his good friends, Mark Twain, stopped by. Now, Twain and Grant had struck up a friendship over the last several years. It was an unusual friendship of sorts because Twain had served briefly with the Confederate Army during the Civil War. But Grant's whole presidency and his post-presidency and his memoirs and even his funeral and his tomb had a very strong sense of reconciliation and reunification. Again, he was the one figure that was beloved by the North and the South. So his life really became emblematic of that reunification between North and South. Now, Mark Twain, when he looked at this contract, he thought that Grant was being insulted, that it was just the type of contract that they'd give any author who walked in the door there. And Twain just so happened to be standing up his own publishing company, Charles L. Webster and Company. So he offered Grant a much more generous contract if he would publish with him. So Grant agreed. The first book that Mark Twain's publishing house ever published was Huck Finn, and the second would be Grant's memoirs. So beginning in November, Grant began to write as his health deteriorated. As his cancer progressed, it became difficult to eat, to sleep, and to talk, until he could only converse by writing notes. His doctors were amazed at his ability to write through such adversity, but they also feared that once Grant finished, he would lose his will to live. On July 19th, 1885, after only 7 or 8 months, he put the finishing touches on what would be considered the best presidential memoir ever. Now, remember, Grant had never written before, and he didn't believe he was a very good writer. But to this day, Grant's memoirs are considered the best memoirs written by a former president in history. And it also made him the most financially successful author in history, post-mortem, because it was published after he died. Now, while Grant had no way of knowing this, what he did know is that he had won his final and perhaps greatest battle by finishing his memoirs before he died. Now, I mentioned that he finished his memoirs on July 19th, 1885. 4 days later, July 23rd, as he lay in a bed in upstate New York, surrounded by his family, Julia's hand clutching his, Ulysses S. Grant died. So now the question was, where would Grant be buried? Now, in his final weeks, Grant tried to discuss his funeral plans with his family. He had written notes specifying some possible burial locations, but Julia was too distraught at the thought of living her life without her beloved Ulysses, and would never have the conversation. But now she was forced to decide. Now, Grant had given her several options. He had mentioned St. Louis and Illinois, where they had lived in the past. He had also mentioned West Point, where he graduated from the military academy. And he'd mentioned New York City. So ultimately, spoiler alert, he chose New York City, or the family chose New York City. But why did Julia choose New York City? So one was the location. I'd mentioned that the Grants lived on 66th Street. So she wanted to be able to visit Grant's tomb whenever she wanted to. Now, the second reason, and the most important reason why she chose New York City, was that with these four options, the one factor that was paramount was that Julia would be buried by Grant's side once her time came. And in West Point or any other national cemetery where other people outside of the family felt that maybe Grant should be buried at Arlington Cemetery or at the Old Soldiers Home in Washington, D.C. Along with West Point, they all had regulations that only the military member could be buried there. So that was the largest factor in Julia's decision to have Grant's tomb in New York City. The other factor is the mayor of New York City at the time. Now, the mayor was William Grace, and Grace aggressively lobbied the family for the honor of hosting Grant's tomb. Now, on the day that Grant had died, he quickly fired off a telegram to Julia, offering his condolences, and then very quickly pivoting to offering his city to be the location of Grant's tomb. And he also very quickly formed the Grant Monument Association, which included Gilded Age elites who would be responsible for creating this tomb for Grant. Now, these Gilded Age elites included former President Chester Arthur, who also lived in New York City at the time, J.P. Morgan, John Jacob Astor, Cornelius Vanderbilt, as well as an honorary position for President Grover Cleveland at the time. Now, the other gentleman on this slide here is Bloomingdale resident, which I recently just found out, thank you, Jim, is Richard Theodore Greener. Now, Greener was given perhaps the most important responsibility when he was elected treasurer for the Grant Monument Association. So Greener was the first African-American graduate from Harvard. He was a prominent attorney and the dean of Harvard Department of Law. And he also, in his own words, had political relations with Grant and enjoyed his friendship during his illness. Now that they had, the family had agreed to to New York City, and they had established a Grant Monument Association. The next thing that they had to do was choose the location. So Mayor Grace invited the family to come down to New York City because Grant had died in Mount McGregor, north of Saratoga Springs, which is where the family was residing in the days after Grant had died, to come down to New York City to choose a location. He was giving the family carte blanche to choose a location. So several days after Grant had died, his son Fred, as well as General William Tecumseh Sherman, toured several locations throughout New York City. One of them, being very close to the Bloomingdale neighborhood, was in Central Park at 106th Street on Great Hill. So Fred climbed the hill and thought that it was a beautiful location for Grant's tomb, but when he looked out in the distance, he saw there was a building being built. And when he asked about it, he was told that it was a cancer hospital being built on 106th Street. So Fred kind of thought, you know what? My father just died of cancer. Maybe this isn't the best location for patients to look out of their window and see a tomb of Grant who had died from cancer. So after seeing several different locations in Central Park, and really everyone thought that Grant should be buried in Central Park. They just figured if he's going to be in New York City, Central Park is the most prominent green space in the city. That's where it would happen. But Grace had one other site in mind. So after taking him to Central Park, he took them to Riverside Park. Now, Grace had hoped that Riverside Park one day would be a tourist and population center of New York City. And Grant's tomb would become the magnet that would draw people there. Now, the New York Times suggested that if Grant was buried in Riverside Park, which that's about where Riverside Park is. So you can see this map is actually from 1885, and it's a tourist map from 1885. Riverside Park, as you all know, is kind of outside of the tourist area of New York City then and really now. But the New York Times had suggested that Riverside Park will probably be rechristened as Grant Park and will soon be virtually in the heart of the city, while Central Park will no longer be uptown. And the New York Parks Commissioner had said, he had proudly suggested that the park is growing in popularity every year and in a short time promises to take the place of Central Park. So with Grace pushing for Riverside Park, one of the reasons he said, since nothing else is there, that the family would really have, or the designers of the tomb can really create something from scratch. They wouldn't have to make it fit into the landscape. Now, certainly there was criticism of Riverside Park, and one reporter had claimed that there's more goats there than people in that area because there were still plenty of villages and farmland in that area in 1885. So once they had chosen New York City, the funeral was held in the city on August 8th. Now, New York City, as everyone here knows, was a much different city in 1885 than it is now. The tallest buildings were only about 10 stories tall, and most of the population was downtown. The well-to-do lived uptown, and there was plenty of mansions in the upper 50s around Fifth Avenue. But the funeral held for Grant, because remember how popular he was the largest funeral ever in American history up until this point, the largest single funeral event in American history. Now, Lincoln's funeral was huge, but Lincoln's funeral occurred in many different cities throughout the country. James Garfield's funeral was also massive, but none were as big as Grant's, and both of those presidents had also been assassinated in office. Now, Grant had died 8 years after leaving the presidency and 20 years after the Civil War, but this just shows how popular he was. So the funeral began in Madison Square. So not where Madison Square Garden is, where the original Madison Square Garden was, on Madison Avenue and 26th Street. There was 60,000 marchers that march in the parade. Thousands and thousands of Union veterans, but also more than a handful of Confederate veterans too also marched in the funeral procession. As well, there were two former Confederate generals who were pallbearers in Grant's funeral, because again, there was that sense of reunification and reconciliation that had begun to permeate Grant's funeral and would become more prominent with the building of his tomb. So the funeral marched for 7 miles. It marched on Broadway, which in the northern part was then called the Boulevard, and much of it was unpaved north of Columbus Circle. It went right through the Bloomingdale neighborhood on Riverside Drive. And 1.5 million people flocked to New York City for the funeral. Now, at the time, the population of New York City was only about 1.4 million. So more people than the entire population came to New York City for the funeral. Now, this vertical photograph over here to the left, I just love. If you look over here, you can see there's a couple of incredibly courageous people that are sitting on top of telephone poles, because the telephone was only recently invented in 1885. But by this point, there was poles and there was wires networked all throughout the city. But to get this bird's eye view, these insane people climbed up on telephone poles just to see Grant's funeral pass by. So at the end was Riverside Park, and Grant's remains were placed in a temporary tomb. Now this is about 125th Street, looking north, so you can see that the city did look much different then than it does now. Now, the big question, though, he was placed in a temporary tomb, and it was rumored that it took the designer about 20 minutes to design the tomb. And you can kind of believe it when you look at it. It's not a very sightly tomb, surely for someone of Grant's prominence, and it almost kind of looks like a pizza oven. But everyone kind of figured he's not going to be in this temporary tomb for very long, because this beautiful grand monument is going to be built in his honor. So, but the big question on people's minds were, what kind of tomb would be built for Grant? And for that, I'm just going to step a little back in history and talk about some of the previous tombs that have been built for some of the previous presidents. Now, George Washington, the first president to die, had a very strong sense of Republican virtues, and that an American president at his core was an American citizen first. And he was no greater or no worse than the average citizen. So much different from the monarchs, the kings and queens and dictators of Europe, where there was grand monuments built in their honor and grand funerals. So Washington was placed in a very humble crypt. The upper picture was his first crypt. He was moved to a new one several years later, and he actually asked for no funeral. Now, there was a very small funeral held for him by Freemasons, but that just it shows his strong sense of that Republican virtues of the time, small r Republican. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, two of our founding fathers, also placed in very humble graves. Now, the one of James Madison is really unusual, because his grave was unmarked for about 22 years after he died. It was just a mound of earth. And it wasn't 22 years later until local citizens chipped in their money to place this shaft over his gravesite. But like everything else in American history, Abraham Lincoln and his assassination changed everything. The Gilded Age started shortly after the Civil War, and by the time that Abraham Lincoln's memorial tomb was completed in 1874, it was the first of these grand Gilded Age monuments to the beloved martyr president, Abraham Lincoln. And this was built at a cost of about $200,000. Now, 16 years later, unfortunately, the second president to be assassinated, James Garfield, there was also a huge memorial tomb built in his honor out in a cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio, where he was from. And this Gothic tomb was built at a cost of about $150,000. But these Gilded Age luminaries on the Grant Monument Association felt that Grant's tomb needed to be bigger, bolder, and more magnificent than anything that had been built before in American history. And they set an aggressive and unprecedented target of $1 million that they wanted to raise through public subscription to build Grant's tomb. Now, remember, Lincoln's was $200,000, Garfield was $150,000. So they wanted to raise about triple what both of those previous tombs combined it cost. So Greener had some work to do because a monumental tomb would cost a monumental amount of money. And so people started to donate to Grant's tomb. There was newspaper drives. You can donate anything and get your name in the New York Times. People would donate 5 cents and they'd get their name listed in the New York Times. There was children that held bake fairs and sales to raise money for Grant's tomb, and they would send in their $1.50 that they raised from it. And there was baseball games held for the Grant Monument Fund. You can see here there's a game between Albany and Troy where every 25-cent ticket, some money goes to the Grant's tomb. But after a very strong start, donations started to taper off. And there were several reasons why that happened, but one of the reasons was people didn't know what they were donating to. The first couple of years had gone by after Grant had died, and there was still no definitive design of what people were donating to. There were several attempts at a design competition, but they all ended in failure. And one of the reasons was the Gilded Age luminaries who were given the solemn task of designing or of creating Grant's tomb kind of went back to being Gilded Age luminaries. They went back to focus on their business. So Grant Monument, the Grant Monument Association really wasn't getting the attention that it deserved to complete Grant's tomb. Now, finally, after 5 years, a design was chosen. And this was by architect John Hemingway Duncan, and it was selected in 1890, 5 years after Grant had died. And this is an illustration of what his original design looked like. And you can tell it's a little bit different than what Grant's tomb looked like today. There's statuary all around it that you won't find there today if you go to Grant's tomb. But also, I think most prominent is this beautiful walkway that goes down to the Hudson River. Now, one of the reasons that Hemingway had added this feature was because there wasn't really public transportation that went that far north in New York City up to 125th Street at this time. So he had figured most people are going to travel there by steamship, and we need to have this beautiful staircase so they can walk up to get to Grant's tomb. So after the design was chosen, even though they didn't quite have enough money, by this point they maybe had like $150,000 of the 1 million that they were trying to get. They decided it was time to start building Grant's tomb. Even after construction began in 1892, the tomb was still plagued with problems. As I mentioned, Greener's efforts had started off strong, but they quickly petered out and were stuck at about $150,000. So there was a final desperate push to raise the rest of the money, not quite the 1 million, but enough to finish the tomb. They raised about $600,000. Not only that, there was stone worker strikes. There was the Panic of 1893, and even after the tomb was begun, there was congressional efforts to relocate the remains of Ulysses S. Grant because New York had taken so long to even start building the tomb. There was target date set to complete the tomb in 1895. That had to get pushed. It went to 1896. That had to get pushed. Finally, on Grant's birthday, April 27th, 1897, the tomb was completed. Now, there was another grand dedication held for Grant's tomb at this time. And New York was changing by leaps and bounds during this period. This was 12 years after Grant had died. And by this point, the largest buildings in New York were over 300 feet tall. Once again, thousands marched up Riverside Drive through the Bloomingdale neighborhood, where now they saw more and more mansions along Riverside Drive that they didn't see there 12 years earlier because the neighborhood was changing. As they marched up Riverside Drive, crowds stood or sat on benches built for the event by entrepreneurs who were charging up to $10 for a seat for the good view of the Grant's tomb dedication. And salesmen who were called fakirs had sold buttons and programs and badges, and some claimed to have chips from the temporary marble tomb that they were selling. So Grant's tomb, as I'd mentioned earlier, was and is the largest tomb in North American history. It is 8,100 cubic feet. It stands at 150 feet tall with these impressive Doric columns in the front of the tomb. And it's as majestic inside and out. It's really almost like a secular presidential cathedral inside. And one thing that all of you are very lucky, because I've talked about Grant's tomb since my book came out in February of last year. You are the first group that I've spoken to that can now go visit Grant's tomb because it was closed throughout COVID and they just recently reopened on weekends. So if you haven't been there, you can get to go see it for yourself now. Now, it was also the largest fundraising effort ever in American history up until this point. Now, I mentioned that they didn't quite raise the $1 million target, but they did. There was about 90,000 individuals who had donated over $600,000 to build Grant's tomb, almost double the cost of Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield's tombs combined. Now, some of the original elements from Duncan's design had to be stripped out, like the statuary, like the staircase going to the Hudson River. But what he had completed was just magnificent. And carved right above the entrance are Grant's words from his campaign, from his presidential campaign, those words of reconciliation and reunification: "Let us have peace." And those words were prominent throughout the funeral and throughout the dedication 12 years later. Now, this massive dedication wasn't just on land either, because the people in the Bloomingdale neighborhood at the time would have seen the parade march up Riverside Avenue, but if they turned to the west and looked out on the Hudson River, they would have seen American battleships and sea craft from foreign countries that filled the Hudson River. The site spanned from about 72nd Street up to 140th Street. And one newspaper praised the civic, military, and naval pageants as most brilliant and one of the most impressive spectacles ever seen in America. So immediately, Grant's tomb became the #1 tourist attraction in New York City. Now remember, Riverside Park wasn't that easy to get to, but every year, 500,000 to 600,000 people flocked to Riverside Park to see Grant's tomb. More people went to Grant's tomb for the first 20 years after it was built than had gone to the Statue of Liberty. And most of the population of New York City was downtown during this period. So Statue of Liberty was much easier to get to than Grant's tomb. But still, more people for 20 years came to Grant's tomb. And it wasn't just Americans either. International visitors would come to Grant's tomb. Just like the Empire State Building today is decorated with different colors for prominent events, Grant's tomb was too. If there was a delegation in New York City from Japan, or from England, or from France, those national colors would be strewn all over the tomb. And it remained that important site for reunification as well, where both Confederates and Union, former enslaved, would come to pay their respects at Grant's tomb. It's really one of the most unique sites in American history in that regard. I really can't think of any other site that had that attraction to really all sections of American population at the time. Now, it was also popular in other regards too. In 1914, there was a women's suffrage parade that was held at Grant's tomb, because perhaps these women identified with the struggle for freedom and civil rights that were really personified by Grant. And there was also movies made about Grant's tomb. In 1905, Thomas Edison's film company created a very silly movie, which you can find on YouTube. It's only about 11 minutes, but it's called How a French Nobleman Got a Wife Through the New York Herald Personal Column. That's the name of the movie. And it's kind of similar to Sleepless in Seattle, where Tom Hanks meets the woman of his dreams at the most prominent site in New York City at the time, which was the Empire State Building. It's kind of a similar plot where this guy wants to meet the woman of his dreams, but he tells these women by placing the personal ad to come to the most prominent site in New York City at the time, which is Grant's tomb. So look it up. It's a very silly movie, but you'll see some really interesting footage of Grant's tomb from 1905. It was also featured in advertisements for the locomotive, or I'm sorry, for the automobile. As well, it was featured on postcards. Now, after Grant had died, it became known as the golden age of postcards, where prominent buildings and prominent scenes would be drawn on postcards and went all around the world, and that would attract more people. When they came to America, they wanted to see Grant's tomb. Now, this particular postcard I bought on eBay, and I just love it. It's got one word on the back, and I think it really kind of wraps up how people felt about Grant's tomb. It just says, wow. Now, this is from 1942, so now we're getting towards the middle of the century, but still, Grant's tomb has that appeal for people. But shortly after this postcard would change, things would begin to, or I'm sorry, shortly after this postcard was sent, things began to change. I mentioned that Southern lost cause ideology. Now, that had begun in the South, had become predominant in the South, where the war wasn't over slavery and the Civil War was a noble cause for states' rights, for the Southern way of life, etc. By the middle of the century, by the 1950s, that became pretty popular throughout the country, not just in the South. And as this ideology took hold, Robert E. Lee's reputation began to rise. And as Lee's reputation began to rise, Grant's reputation would go in the inverse direction. So Grant, who had once been heralded as one of the greatest men in America, was now criticized as a drunk, as lucky, as corrupt, as a bad general, as a butcher. And that really began to take hold. This was right around the time as well when Groucho Marx utters that famous line, "Who's buried in Grant's tomb?" So you see, it kind of has a little more significance maybe than just a throwaway joke on a game show. It really kind of shows some of the lack of reverence towards Grant and Grant's tomb that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Now, also in 1956, the last Civil War veteran dies. So you really have this shift in attitudes about the Civil War and attitudes about Grant. And right around this time, the National Park Service takes over control over Grant's tomb. So they didn't realize it, but they were coming at a very controversial time in the history of Grant and of his tomb. Because starting in the mid-1960s, as Grant's reputation is cratering, is hitting rock bottom, the neighborhood around Grant's tomb in Riverside Park on the outskirts of Harlem, all throughout New York City began to change. Crime began to rise. Less and less people came to Grant's tomb over the years. And where once thousands of people would visit Grant's tomb every day, that number started to dwindle down until it was maybe in the dozens. Riverside Park, starting in the 1960s, really all up until like the mid 1990s, became more popular with gangs. Homeless would take shelter on the steps of Grant's tomb. Drug addicts would hang around Riverside Park and Grant's tomb. vandals. As you can see, the graffiti that had become omnipresent on Grant's tomb. People like this woman would try to clean Grant's tomb. The National Park Service would clean it. And then the next day, all the graffiti would be back again.
Yeah, I see it.
Now, in short, Grant's tomb really became a disgrace. And once again, there was congressional efforts to remove the bodies and place them and have them moved from New York City to somewhere else. One of the most prominent locations that was lobbying for Grant's tomb, for Grant and Julia's tomb, was Illinois. Now, they had claimed, hey, we take care of Lincoln's tomb. You never see these type of problems in our state. Please move Grant's body, have them moved to Illinois, and we'll take care of them in a way that New York City obviously isn't doing. And Ohio made the case too to relocate Grant's tomb. Now, I mentioned that this condition persisted for about 30 years, up until the mid-1990s. And it might have been lost to history. The remains might have been moved, the tomb might have been destroyed, if it wasn't for some individuals that really became very important to the story of Grant's tomb. And I was able to interview both of these individuals for my book, and they really helped contribute to shape the story of Grant's tomb. The first one is Frank Scaturo. He's the individual from the newspaper. Now, Frank Scaturo was a young law student at the time at Columbia University in the early 1990s. And he was always enamored with Grant and the presidents, but that really wasn't the reason that Frank had chosen Columbia University. It just happened to be within a stone's throw of Grant's tomb. So he had went to go visit Grant's tomb. He had visited so much, he had started to volunteer at Grant's tomb. And he became horrified by what he saw there. Not only were the grounds being desecrated, vandals were spray painting the building. They were destroying the grounds. They were damaging the tomb. But also, we found that much of the records stored within Grant's tomb and many of the artifacts had also been destroyed and had been lost to history either through neglect or either through willfully being destroyed. So he had tried to raise awareness. He had written a huge report and sent it to anyone who would listen, including the president. He was interviewed on an NBC morning show, and he was also written about in the New York Times. I like to think of Frank as maybe the head of the movement to save Grant's tomb. But the gentleman to the right, Ulysses Grant Dietz, who was great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant, I think also as the heart of the operation. Because while Frank was a concerned citizen and did his best to raise awareness, he was only just a citizen. And it was easier to ignore Frank, but not so easy to ignore Ulysses Grant Dietz, the great-great-grandson of Ulysses and Julia Grant. And it was his family member. It was his family members in that tomb that was being so disgraced. So together, they sued the National Park Service, the federal government, to demand that that money be set aside for repairs and for increased security. And the turnaround from the early 90s, 1993, 1994, over the next couple years was really nothing short of miraculous. And for that, you need to thank not only Frank and Ulysses Grant Dietz, but also the National Park Service. Because once they began to dedicate money and to dedicate efforts, they really did so with gusto. And they very quickly turned around Grant's tomb. In 1997, there was a rededication ceremony that was held, where once again, people marched through the Bloomingdale neighborhood to get to Grant's tomb. It wasn't quite the parade that was held in 1897, but 100 years later, there was another parade and another rededication held at Grant's tomb. And Ulysses Grant Dietz, who had spoken that day, had said, "I believe that Grant's tomb can easily inspire that same sense of sympathy and hope and pride in a modern day audience, an audience far bigger and far more complicated than the one a century ago." Now, so not only has Grant's tomb come back like a phoenix from the ashes, but also Ulysses S. Grant has too. Now, I mentioned that Grant's popularity had really sunk in the 1950s. It had stayed that way up until the mid 1990s. Now, every so often they do these presidential polls for the best to the worst presidents. In 1994, Grant was ranked as our fourth worst president. The only ones below him were James Buchanan, Warren G. Harding, and Andrew Johnson. So he was really kind of like in the cellar dwellers of presidents, if you will. But starting in 1994, right around the time that Grant's tomb began to come back, Grant's reputation began to come back too. And now one of the reasons were historians began to take a much closer look at the period when Grant was president during Reconstruction. And they looked closer at how Grant had fought for African-American rights in the South by crushing the KKK. They looked closer at how he fought for Native American rights during the period, as well as other accomplishments that had been widely overlooked by historians over the past generations. Now, every year since 1994, Grant has moved up in the presidential rankings, and there was just one done in 2021 where Grant now ranks as our 20th best president. No other president has even come close to having that sort of trend over this last generation, like Ulysses S. Grant. So not only has the tomb come back, but so has Grant. So like the man, Grant's tomb also has an important and fascinating history, and thank you for listening to its story. Thank you. That's my conclusion. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I have a question, Louis, and your book covers this somewhat, but it's almost difficult to appreciate that when they were raising the money for this, and you emphasize the amount, the likes of which had never been done before, but it seems like they almost wrote the book on how to do it. And I would think other organizations thereafter would benefit from this, whether they fully appreciate that or not. And that this was a private endeavor. I mean, this is before our federal government started acquiring national parks and making national monuments, which today we kind of accept as the way it's always been done.
Yeah, I think, that's a good point. I think first they wrote the book on how not to do it. And that book lasted about 7 years. It was a long time that they were struggling with funding. They basically raised almost nothing after the first 6 months after Grant died. For the next several years, they were struggling to raise money. So they pretty much did everything wrong for those first 7 years. But there's a couple other people that are critical to the story, and I just had to omit them due to a time constraint. But also key to the Grant Monument Association story was a change in leadership. It was almost like a coup d'etat, where Mayor Grace was kind of removed from power, and Horace Porter, who was a Civil War general, very friendly to Grant, was very dismayed about the direction that the Grant Monument Association was going. So he managed to join the association, quickly become its president, and then fill its ranks with people that he knew and people that were sympathetic to Grant and people that were enthusiastic about completing the tomb. So he partnered up with kind of like this mysterious, shady character who had done fundraising for the Columbian Exposition, which was held in the next year, but the fundraising was done in the previous year. And they partnered up together, and they just, you're right, and they pretty much wrote the book on how to do fundraising. because they engaged all of the different communities throughout New York City, business communities, local organizations. And because so many people outside of New York City were hostile to New York City being the location, because they felt that New York City shouldn't be where Grant is buried. He should be buried on national ground, that New York City somehow swindled the family into agreeing to have Grant's tomb there. So what they did is they kind of played on that. They used that to their advantage, and they kind of framed it as, hey, everyone outside of New York City doesn't think that we can raise the money. Let's show them that we can do it. And then through these different means, they managed to raise about $350,000 in 3 months, when in the previous 7 years, they'd only raised about $150,000. But you're absolutely right. This was all through public subscription. There was no federal funding at the time for these monuments. That was kind of starting at around the time that Grant's tomb was completed. There was this period where there was more attention given to like historic places and historic monuments. But Grant's tomb was done completely without federal funding. Even though the Grant Monument Association tried to get federal funding, they were unsuccessful at it, because they were kind of looked at it like, hey, you're not doing the job, we're not going to pay you for it. So you guys signed up for it, you guys figure it out. And that's kind of what they did.
Well, another accolade to the whole phenomena, you touch upon it with the number of people, the 1.5 million people that went to the dedication ceremony. But in your book, it's more astounding in a different sense. You talk about all of the living presidents being at the event, the entire cabinet, virtually every senator and congressperson, generals, every Union general for sure, I think, who was alive showed up. And in my head, and I'm sure Pam and even Caitlin are thinking that they all kind of went through our neighborhood, all these really famous people, because the dedication ceremony kind of got them there. It's just astounding.
Yeah, you would have had the former presidents normally stayed at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which was in Union Square. I think it's a Lego store now. The last time that I was there, but that was one of the most famous hotels in the city. But it was also the Republican headquarters. So that's where they joined the procession. And at the funeral, there was President Grover Cleveland, who came right through your neighborhood in carriages as well. There was Rutherford B. Hayes, former President Rutherford B. Hayes, as well as former President Chester Arthur, who served on the Grand Monument Association. At the dedication, now William McKinley was president, so he also came right through your neighborhood.
Wow.
So
And
you've had some very prominent people there in Bloomington.
Yeah, and all the Supreme Court justices, literally all of them.
Yep. Yeah. Grant's funeral and the dedication was an event that nobody wanted to miss. It was an event where one newspaper had said that it has global significance, that never has a former leader had this spontaneous outpouring before in world history.
But for reasons that are very complicated, Pam Tice has a lot of bicycle history background. But one of my favorite images is so many bikes. When that came into vogue, people riding bicycles on, they all seem to go up to Grant's tomb. Do you know anything about that attraction? Is it just Riverside Park or?
Yeah, you're right. It became, when bicycling became big, was right around the time when Grant's tomb was dedicated. And I think it was just that confluence of you have this new crazy activity, this fad, and the most prominent building in New York City being built along this beautiful scenic Riverside Drive. So it became extremely popular with bicyclists.
And they also dropped by the Claremont Inn. You could stop and have a little refreshment.
Yep.
See the tomb, and then cycle back downtown again.
Yeah. Now, it also became very popular when the automobile was invented too. There was automobile clubs that would have their rides past Grant Tomb. And then it became very popular with skateboarders in the 1980s, although unfortunately they were damaging the tomb. They were kind of like part of the problem in the 1980s, some of them, not to disparage skateboarders, but they were damaging the steps of the tomb as they were skateboarding on it.
Right.
Later on, there was a skate park built for them in Riverside Park to draw them away from the tomb.
Wow.
All right, Louis, thank you for your talk. We do have a few questions that people asked, so I'm gonna ask them to you from them.
Okay.
Do you know if there was ever a dock for water access built? And have you heard anything about a plan for the 200th anniversary?
No, the dock wasn't built because even by the time of the dedication, there was public transportation that would go up there. So there was elevated railroads. So along with the highway that was built there, the West Side Highway, it really kind of squashed the plans for that walkway going down there. So the dock wasn't built, but there were efforts to really complete Duncan's vision of Grant's tomb. And that had taken place in the 1920s, where they were going to build this grand promenade and all the statuary that you saw all around it. Because there was always that desire to top off Grant's tomb with a statue of some sort and to put equestrian statues of Grant all around. So there was money raised. It was very quickly about $125,000 that was raised in 1929 to really complete Duncan's vision. But you can probably guess where this is going. October 1929, the Great Depression hits, and now all of a sudden people, those checks are starting to bounce that people did send in, and nobody else is sending any money in. So yeah, the plan just kind of fizzles.
Okay. Speaking of money and fundraising, do you know if St. Louis, Missouri ever lobbied for Grant's tomb?
St. Louis didn't lobby for Grant's tomb. And plus, I realized I didn't answer the second part of your first question. I'm sure there's going to be a huge event at Grant's tomb, but but I don't have the details for it. But every year on Grant's birthday, the National Park Service does a stupendous job at honoring Grant. Next year is the 200th anniversary of Grant's birth, so I'm sure it's going to be a spectacular event, and I will be there. I'm looking forward to it. Second question, for St. Louis, they weren't really lobbying for Grant's tomb, but interestingly, when they started to raise the money for Grant's tomb, it's hard to imagine now, but there wasn't any statues built for Grant at the time. So as Grant's tomb is being imagined after Grant had died, all of a sudden there's all these other Grant memorial efforts cropping up all throughout the country. And some of them were called the Grant Monument Association. So that kind of added to the confusion and to the lack of fundraising too, or to the fundraising problems. One of those was in St. Louis, where they wanted to build a monument to Grant, which ended up being an equestrian statue of Grant. And they actually had asked General William Sherman to be the president of that Grant Monument Association in St. Louis. Now, Sherman had politely declined, citing, right now we should focus on the tomb. Let's build the tomb, and then we can focus on these other Grant monument efforts.
Do you know why they reference it as General Grant's Memorial, not President Grant's Memorial?
Yeah, well, Grant was famous for being the general that won the Civil War, not so much as president. His president, there was some successes again that have been overlooked by historians, but there was also several scandals during Grant's presidency. He even had said during his farewell address that I readily admit that I made mistakes, but they weren't through my will. They weren't willful mistakes. So he was much more beloved in the country as General Grant. Now, not only that, because he was so concerned about his family's finances in those final months, he actually lobbied to be reinstated as General Grant. And the last thing that Chester Arthur did in his presidency was sign the order to reinstate Grant as general. Now, why did he do that? One was probably sentimental, that he wanted to die as General Grant rather than President Grant. But also at the time, presidents didn't get a pension. It wasn't until Harry Truman that presidents got a pension. Generals, meanwhile, got a pension. And not only did the generals get a pension, but their widows got a pension too. So Grant was doing that for sentimental reasons, but also practical reasons, that if the book wasn't successful, and he had no reason to believe that it was really going to cover all of the debt that Julia would inherit, that she'd at least have this pension after he passed away.
Thank you. Is the colonnade on the west side of the tomb part of the original plan? And if it was, or how was it used?
Oh, you mean the like the building on the side? That was originally designed as a bathroom, as a public bathroom. And then that was later closed down as a bathroom, and then it was then the visitors center for the National Park Service was placed in that building. But I think there's an entrance. The last time that I was there, there's an entrance to the National Park Service Visitors Center where it still says men above the entrance. But yeah, that was built, I think, in the early 1900s, because there wasn't any public restrooms there.
Do we know if there was a ceremony when Julia interned at the tomb? Was she known as a beloved, or was she just unknown to the public?
There was a ceremony held for it, not so much at the tomb, but at her funeral mass, or at her funeral service. Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time, came to her funeral, which was pretty unusual for former presidents or for sitting presidents to attend former first ladies' funerals. At the tomb, there really wasn't much of a ceremony held there. The remains were placed besides her husband, but there wasn't a grand ceremony held at the tomb.
Got it. Can you tell us more about Richard Greener? Oh, sorry, did Richard Greener remain as treasurer after the porter became the head of the association?
No, he had, there was some, when, so he was paid, I think, $200 per month for his services as treasurer. But when the Grant Monument Association, when the efforts were really going downhill, because there was a really difficult period in those first couple of years. So he had opted to lower his salary to just $100 per month. And then after the Grant Monument Association, started to get back on track, he had lobbied to get his salary reinstated to $200. But he had left as part of that coup d'etat that I had mentioned earlier, where Horace Porter had taken over as president, and several people either had quit outright. I think Greener has just decided that he wasn't going to be nominated for re-election as treasurer, so he had bowed out at that time. But 1892 was kind of that pivotal year where they had this whole new regime had come in to take over control of the Grant Monument Association, and they're the ones that had kind of taken the ball over the finish line, and they quickly put the GMA back on track.
Got it. Could you talk a little bit more about the adjacent pavilion that's next to the tomb?
You know what? Maybe I just talked about that when I was speaking about. Yeah, that was the bathroom.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Okay. And then the other part is, do you know how the mosaic decorated low walls came to be?
I was waiting for someone to ask about the benches. Yeah, that was. So in the 1960s and 1970s, as I mentioned, conditions were really bad at the tomb. And there was graffiti every day. There was graffiti on the tomb. People would come in, those national park rangers would come in for the day's work, and they would have to clear out the beer bottles and the drug paraphernalia and the remnants of the homeless that had used the portico overnight, and just other horrible things they would have to clean up. So as an effort to try to get the community to embrace Grant's tomb, they came up with an idea to have the community really participate in designing these avant-garde benches that would circle the tomb. And the idea was have the community come out. There was one individual that kind of led the effort, but the community would come out and they would build these benches, and it would really, the idea was that the community then would embrace Grant's tomb and they would stop vandalizing Grant's tomb. So the first part worked. They built these benches, which are interesting. They're very controversial. Some people love them, some people hate them. They're undoubtedly unusual for a tomb to have these mosaic benches. Again, very almost like psychedelic and avant-garde. They were built during the 70s. But if the goal was to reduce the vandalism, then they failed miserably. Because while nobody vandalized the benches, they still kept vandalizing Grant's tomb. But for some reason, you very rarely saw spray paint on the benches. That they loved. But Grant's tomb, they continue to damage. Like you see those eagles in the front in this image here. They were actually taken from a post office that was closed down. So they took these two eagles and kind of placed them by Grant's tomb. You can see in this image here, the beak is broken off of the eagle. So they would damage the tombs. Reportedly, the National Park Service had some spare beaks because that would happen pretty frequently. So yeah, the vandalism continued, but the benches were untouched. And to this day, there's always controversy about removing them, about whether they should be there or not, but they almost seem to have now become a part of Grant's tomb and almost part of the story.
Thank you. When were the equestrian statues of the commanders for the Grand Army erected?
Yeah, they were the WPA. So in the Great Depression, which almost seems like the opposite of what you'd expect, but many of these historic sites, there was funding dedicated through the WPA, through Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, where they invested in these historic sites. Grover Cleveland's birthplace in Caldwell, New Jersey was one of them, as well as Grant's tomb. So they had done repairs of Grant's tomb, but they also, one of the programs was the Federal Artist Program, where they had put out of work artists to work. And so some of these WPA artists created the busts that now encircle and keep vigil over Grant and Julia's tombs, including Sheridan and General Sherman, as well as others. So they were created during the Great Depression through the WPA.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so that we have a little bit more of a local question, but do you know how the jazz aficionados that are playing on every Wednesday night in front of the Grant's tomb over the summer, do you know how they got permission or how they were allowed to be or play out there, or was it just kind of
I don't know, but I'll kind of like do the old trick of answering what I do know, which is there was one of the other efforts back in the 70s for Grant's tomb to attract visitors was they held jazz concerts on the grounds. So I'm not familiar with the current jazz program, but there was jazz programs held in the 70s too, as well as different kind of almost like carnival types of events where they had puppeteers and they had different ethnic food and jugglers to kind of create this diverse event at Grant's tomb to draw the community in. But I don't know anything about the current one, so sorry.
No worries, it's fine. All right, so then we have a hand raised from Peter Arnson. He's also a member of the Bloomingdale History Group. So I'm going to let him talk. And then...
this has been a great presentation. Thanks, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I was curious if you wanted to say anything further about how his reputation went so far downhill after the 50s. I mean, I was was born in 55 and grew up thinking of him as a failed president and as a drunk. And I am really appreciative of everything you've said. So if you wanted, I was curious if there was somebody or some group that had been instrumental in changing his reputation.
Yeah, interestingly, I interviewed Ulysses Grant Dietz for my book too, and he had told me about that similar trajectory where, as a youngster, he actually went by the name Grant, not Ulysses Grant Dietz. In some ways, he was embarrassed to be his great grandson because you're right. Years ago, he had that reputation of a drunkard and a butcher and corrupt. I think one of the key developments in restoring Grant's reputation is restoring focus on the Reconstruction period. So that's the period after the Civil War when Grant was president, and it's really been a period that was probably understudied until the last couple of generations. And one person that I'll give credit is actually someone who, at least until recently, worked in your neighborhood, who is Professor Eric Foner from Columbia University. He's just done tremendous work on writing about the period of Reconstruction and really giving that renewed focus to it. And I think part of that is the better understanding now of the Reconstruction period and the challenges that faced Grant while he was president, and the efforts that Grant had done, one, to crush the KKK. This is really a terrorist organization that had formed to suppress African-American freed slave African-American rights in the South. But the KKK that most people know now wasn't formed until the early 1900s. The KKK had started to form under Grant, and it was crushed under Grant as well, too. That and just other elements of his presidency. One thing that Grant had done, too, was after the Civil War, we almost went to war with Great Britain because Great Britain was supplying some ships to the Confederacy because they had a vested interest in restarting the cotton trade. So Grant had handled that, had managed to handle that through international diplomacy, where there was a conference held in Switzerland to really address the issues that America had with Great Britain and to really come to a peaceful outcome, to a peaceful settlement. So that's really one of the first instances of international diplomacy used to prevent a war that had happened under Grant. So there's just a lot of renewed focus on Grant, but I think the reason that Grant had gone so downhill was that Southern lost cause revisionism. And when one goes up, like Grant can't be a hero if the Southern lost cause, if Robert E. Lee is a hero as well, too. And if the Southern cause was righteous, which is what the lost cause revisionism professes, then Grant can't be a hero anymore. So his reputation goes downhill as Lee's goes up. And what I found fascinating is that Dwight Eisenhower had a painting of Robert E. Lee in the Oval Office, but not one of Grant. So in the 1950s, there was also a stamp set that I had found about American leaders where Robert E. Lee had a stamp, but Grant didn't. So it was just, I think that's one of the reasons why it had gone downhill. And now that historians have looked closer at this lost cause revisionism and at the Reconstruction period, Grant has just there's the books, Ron Chernow's book about Grant. So there's been much more attention to Grant, justifiably so, and his reputation has risen.
Thank you. I'll look forward to reading the book.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we have two more raised hands one from Gail, so I'll allow her to talk. Let's see.
Hi, that's okay. The question was about the pavilion. I know that the pavilion was built because Grant's tomb became so popular, there was no facilities. And so they, instead of doing a small, just sort of a comfort station kind of thing, they chose to site the elaborate view, the lovely view pavilion with the bathrooms below it. And there's a similar one north, well, I guess you'll talk about it on when we talk about Riverside Drive, just north of the George Washington Bridge. But this goes, my other question was about the postcards, I had written a question about the water access, because there's so many postcards of water access to Grant's tomb where people are on boats. I mean, it's sort of, it seems like a false history then if there was never any water. And it would be, and now that there's all these water access and ferries, and they're going to be bringing more ferries in, it would be a really good opportunity to have ferries come to Grant's tomb as a beautiful place to visit. And I don't know, that just why are there so many postcards?
Well, yeah, maybe to go back to that question, because Grant's tomb, yeah, because again, there was this, it's just really interesting how so many of these events happened like at the same time. So right around the same time of Grant's tomb, there's a reduction in rates for postcards, and private industries now can create postcards because it used to be dominated by the federal government. So there starts to become what's known, like I said, the golden age of postcards. And all of these designs are being put on postcards to boost sales. And Grant's tomb is the most popular attraction in New York City. So obviously Grant's tomb is going to be featured on postcards a lot. Now, some of them are photographs, other ones are drawings, and sometimes they're fanciful drawings of what Grant's tomb should look like, not what it actually looks like. And really all throughout the history of Grant's tomb, there's many of these drawings of the temporary tomb and of the permanent tomb that don't always match reality. One of the things is that there wasn't really much mature vegetation in that area. But they would create Grant's tomb with all these weeping willows around and full growth trees that really weren't in the area at the time. Some of it was more symbolic. So that's why he was featured on postcards a lot. Okay. Like Grant's tomb was so prominent on postcards. And I have a couple that I've just purchased from eBay, but there's tons of them out there. As far as the waterway, yeah, I think the advent of public transportation, less and less people were coming there by water, maybe not as many as they envisioned, but it was really just the reduction of, they didn't raise the $1 million that they wanted to, they only got $600,000, so they had to kind of cut out pieces from it. So the tomb was supposed to be 160 feet tall with a 100 square foot base. They brought it down to 150 feet tall. 151 foot tall, I think, with a 90 foot base. So they had to make all of these reductions to complete the tomb. And one of those elements that were sacrificed was that walkway down to the Hudson. But I just think now it's no longer really feasible because of the highway there. So yeah, I'm not sure if you'll ever see that, even if they do manage, because there are still efforts to add to Grant's tomb, to add that statue on top, or to add statuary throughout Grant's tomb. There's still, the Grant Monument Association was rejuvenated under Frank Scaturo. So just in the last 25 years or so, part of the efforts to bring back Grant's tomb was rejuvenating the Grant Monument Association. And they still have their eyes on adding some of those elements that were in Duncan's design. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Last question, I think, before we start wrapping, or last two questions before we start wrapping it up. Did the Grant's travel abroad add to his large popularity at his death? That's one of the questions. Yes.
Yeah, everywhere Grant went for 2.5 years, Grant just wanted to travel as like an average citizen. Grant had this travel bug back when he was in the Mexican-American War, when he was stationed out in California and Oregon. He kind of had this travel bug in him. And after he was president, just several months later, in May, he boards a ship to go to Europe. Now, his daughter lived in England, so he wanted to go see her. But his plan was he was just going to travel through Europe as long as his money held out. But everywhere he went, he was feted like royalty. And again, kings and queens and princes would line up. They would go out of the way to come see Grant. Grant almost never went out of the way to go meet with a king or queen. He wanted to just walk the streets like any other tourist. But he ended up, one of the reasons was he really wasn't spending much money, because everywhere he went, he was being put up in hotels. There was state dinners held in his honor. He was given access to palaces and yachts. So he really wasn't spending much money. So he managed to prolong his trip, again, due to that love of travel as well, for 2.5 years. And it was unprecedented how he was treated. Everywhere he went, didn't matter what country, what continent, they were laying out the red carpet for him. So that definitely added to his popularity at home. And as I mentioned, at the dedication, there was warships from all over the globe that were sent to pay their respects to Grant at the dedication, as well as foreign dignitaries came to the funeral as well. Now, one thing is interesting is that when he came home, he had contemplated running for president again. And I just think his experience from traveling the world and getting to know all of those world leaders, what a much better president that would have made him had he been nominated in 1880.
And then the last question is, do we know anything about the temporary tomb, whether it's still in existence?
No, it was well, one problem that Grant's tomb always had from the beginning were relic hunters. Not even Grant's tomb, Grant's funeral, where people would try to steal pieces of the hearse or take ribbons off of the cloth on the funeral hearse. So relic hunters would try to chip pieces off of the temporary tomb. Now, a whole nother side story to this, there was a military unit that was stationed at Grant's tomb for 1 year after Grant had died. It was called Camp Grant. And they were just stationed there protecting the tomb. Then later on, the city took over responsibility for it. But anyway, there was all these relic hunters that would try to chip pieces off of Grant's tomb, off of his temporary tomb. Now, the temporary tomb ended up lasting 12 years, which is longer than any other presidential temporary tomb lasted. But what the city had done and what the Grant Monument Association had done was willfully destroy it. They did keep several bricks that were stored in a jail downtown. And they were given out to Grant Monument Association members, and there was like 56 bolts that held the top of the sarcophagus to protect the coffin. Those were all preserved and given out as souvenirs. Now, the National Park Service does have a handful of those bricks from the temporary tomb. The last time I was there was a couple on display. But I'd say 99% of the original tomb has been lost to history, that it was destroyed.
All right. Well, with that, I think we can conclude tonight's presentation.
Okay. Louis, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. That was really terrific. And
No,
we've gotten
thank you.
lots of comments. People have really enjoyed the evening.
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you.
thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, and just thanks to everybody too. These were by far and away the best questions that I've ever received. So thank you so
good.
much for that. I've ever been asked. So a very intelligent and thoughtful audience. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Have a great night.
Okay. Thank you. Good night.